My name is Helen Allen. I'm the executive director of the Winter Show. We are in our 72nd year, and we are an institution made by and benefits Eastside House Settlement, one of New York's leading service organizations. I'd like to welcome Beyond Blue and White, Women Who Shaped the Global History of Ceramics, our moderator, Charlotte Vignon, who did a wonderful keynote speech here several years ago, Genevieve Wheeler Brown, who we worked together at Christie's years ago and have been friends ever since, my former mentor and friend, Jody Wilkie, and dear friend, Robert Aronson, who's got a spectacular booth here on the show floor. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to Genevieve Wheeler Brown.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Helen. And it's wonderful to be here at the Winter Show, especially with Charlotte and Jody and Robert. And Beyond Blue and White really just brought us together. And writing this book took over 5 years, and it's really quite a journey. And it took me across America, across England, and the Netherlands, of course. And I followed the story of one particular decorative art, a form of ceramics that have captivated people for centuries. And that, of course, is Dutch Delftware. So, yes, those luminous, as we see, are the blue and white ceramics made in Holland, beginning in the Dutch Golden Age. Yes, Delftware is tin-glazed earthenware, named for the city of Delft, and where it was made from about 1620 through the mid-19th century. At its heart, Beyond Blue and White is a book not just about beautiful objects. It's really about women, too. The women who made the Delftware, inspired it, commissioned it, collected it, wrote about it, and then the women who preserved it. In 2019, I was asked to review the Delftware collection of the National Society of Colonial Dames in the state of New York. Now, I really expected I was there to see a few plates, maybe a couple vases, but instead I found myself surrounded by over 75 pieces of 17th and 18th century Dutch Delftware. This was a remarkable and unexpected cache. And among all these treasures, well, a certain piece caught my eye, a small blue and white pitcher. Or so I thought it was. Now, it turned out to be something far more interesting. It actually was something kind of mischievous. It was a puzzle jug. Now, with its pierced neck, which we can see here, and multiple spouts, this was designed to trick you. Puzzle jugs were literally the life of the party of 17th and 18th century Europe. They were engineering marvels disguised as tableware, right? With hidden channels. We see that's a hollow handle and secret holes. Now, it meant that you had to puzzle out the means to sip from this. Now, you get it right, you earned your wine. Get it wrong, and you literally wore it. So I lifted this puzzle jug, and I turned it over, and there it was. 3 initials, Fuchs and Cobalt, G, V, S. Now, after going to the reference books, I discovered something that I was not expecting. Her name, Gertrude Verstelle. A woman, a pottery owner, and a story. Now, 3 little letters that literally stopped me in my tracks. So they cracked open centuries of forgotten history. Who was she? And really, how many other women were hidden in Delftware's story? And the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that women weren't the footnotes of Delftware by any means. They were literally everywhere, and perhaps we've imagined that potteries were male domains, but in Delft from the 17th through the mid-19th century, 1 in 5 listed pottery owners were, in fact, female. So these were not small workshops by any means. Single pottery could produce, well, over 200,000 objects a year. They had employed dozens of workers and often run with women at the helm. So why Delft, right? Dutch women could inherit. They could own businesses. They were educated in reading, writing, arithmetic, and yes, are you ready for it? Accounting. So with men away or lost with the Dutch East India Company voyages, women stepped in with this population disparity in the Dutch Republic, shaping Delftware and the Dutch economy itself. And there's the proof. There it is, GVS. Gertrude Verstelle, her CEO initials fused in cobalt on clay. Now, the history of women's stewardship doesn't end for Delftware with the owners of potteries. They were, of course, the patrons, and Delftware's biggest fan was Queen Mary II, and she ruled over England from 1689 to 94 as co-monarch with William. Married at just 15 to her cousin, William of Orange, she moved to Holland, where she fell in love with Dutch Delftware. And when she came back as Queen of England, she brought that passion back with her. 1690s, Hampton Court, she transforms an old riverside boathouse into her legendary water gallery. It was a maison de plaisir of blue and white. Tulip vases, tiles almost 2 feet wide. These are canvases in Delft. The water gallery even had a pleasure dairy where milk and cream were served in Delft dishes, just like this one from the V&A. Remember, this is a full century before Marie Antoinette and her dairy at Versailles. Now, Daniel Defoe later wrote that Mary had made it fashionable to decorate houses with china, quote, to the tops of the ceilings. And she turned Delftware also into an international sensation. But by the late 18th century, the Dutch Golden Age had ended. Trade collapsed. Porcelain from European factories, you know it, Meissen, Sèvres, and that creamware from England, from Staffordshire, was stealing the spotlight. And by 1835, all but one of the Delft potteries had closed. So that could have been the end of the story for Delftware, right? But in the mid-19th century, blue and white makes a spectacular comeback. The press called it China Mania. Imagine the Victorian parlors so overloaded with blue and white that mantels, walls, door frames were disappearing under Chinese porcelain, Japanese bowls, Isnik dishes. Here we see the Dutch tiles, and of course, they were now calling the, quote, Old Delft. Now, 19th century America, we have the China hunters. These are spirited women who boarded trains and into carriages to go China hunting. Now, they knocked on doors across New England and the Mid-Atlantic to buy up old blue directly from households, and they turned ceramic collecting into female adventure. Now, picture them. They're rumbling down dusty lanes, they're knocking on doors, and they're peeking through windows, inquiring about your family heirlooms, including Delftware tucked away on kitchen shelves. Now, artists, writers fueled the blue and white collecting crazes. Of course, you know Whistler, painting porcelain into his portraits. And this is Jenny Young, the young New Yorker who wrote The Ceramic Art, 1875, same time. A work so popular here in America that it had full-page coverage in the New York Times. There's also Alice Morse Earle, here she is here, who turns decorative arts into household conversations in the 19th century with 17 best-selling books. She also wrote more than 47 magazine articles on everything from furniture to, yes, Delftware. Same time, Holland mania is sweeping America from the 1880s to the 1920s, and all of a sudden we have everything from Dutch boy paints to Dutch colonial revival architecture. Even Vermeer, long forgotten for centuries, is suddenly rediscovered and becomes the must-have painter of Gilded Age collectors. So at this very moment, when women across the country were pursuing old blue, and if truly lucky, finding a piece of that old Delft, a very different adventure was unfolding here in New York City. On March 2nd of 1897, at the height of the Gilded Age, Alice Claypole Vanderbilt, that's Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, opens the doors of her chateau-like home. This is an entire city block next door to the plaza, which you can see on the right, to more than 200 female guests. Her daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the future founder of the Whitney Museum, was standing by her side. And it was in this ballroom here on the slide that Alice and her fellow members of one of New York's newest female organizations gathered. It was called the National Society of Colonial Dames in the state of New York. Quite a mouthful, right? So that day, the women enjoyed tea, a lecture, and a private exhibition of rare silver furniture, and of course, blue and white. But make no mistake, this gathering of these women was not just social. They were plotting something pretty unprecedented. They were founding their own museum. It would be called the Van Cortlandt House Museum. And think about it, it's 1897. Alice Vanderbilt and these women couldn't vote, and they weren't welcome on museum boards, right, including the Met, but they decided instead to found their own. And the women chose a site located in the Bronx, actually. It's steeped in history. This land was acquired by the Dutch West India Company in 1639, and then it was soon after purchased by Adrian van der Donck, who was the rival of Peter Stuyvesant. So in 1748, they built this building. The descendants, it was a stone house, and this house welcomed guests from everyone from George Washington to the future King William IV. On opening day, this Van Cortlandt House Museum on May 27 of 1897 drew over 1,200 visitors. And that summer, if you can believe it, as many as 5,000 people came a day by train or newly fashionable bicycle. Now, the New York Times called this, quote, by far one of the most interesting free museums in our city. In 1903, the museum gained a new attraction, its Dutch garden. It spread across 5 acres, and this was anything but modest. It had a system of Dutch-style canals and parterres with radiating paths from a central fountain, evoking Het Loo in Holland, the Dutch Versailles created by William and Mary. And each spring, here, more than 100,000 tulips would come into bloom. The garden, the museum, and its Delftware formed a living tribute to New York's Dutch roots. By 1965, the women had transformed what began in the 1890s into a nationally recognized permanent collection with more than 75 pieces of 17th and 18th century Dutch Delftware, including a puzzle jug with the initials GVS. By the 1960s, New York City, under severe financial strain with shrinking municipal support, the museum in this park was vulnerable and the Delftware was at risk. In 1965, the women made a really difficult decision, and they moved the collection, not by choice, but to protect it, and it found its new home here at the headquarters of the Dames on East 71st Street, beginning its next chapter high above the streets of Manhattan. So this afternoon, we've met just a few of the women who are connected to Delftware. They're pottery owners, queens, collectors, writers, museum founders. The next time you see a piece of Delft, especially here at the show, I hope you look at it not just as a beautiful object, but really as also a vessel to tell women's stories. So with that, let's continue the conversation and explore even more revelations in ceramics. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Vivi, for this wonderful presentation. I encourage all of you to read the book because it's really a book that matters and that tell a story that has not been told before. And we really thank you for writing that page of history, that it's very important for the history of ceramics. You mentioned in your book and in this presentation too, many women, and there is also men, but many people, let's put it that way, who were fascinated also by this, by ceramic, by Delftware, but also by other type of ceramics. And we're going to open the conversation. It's going to be a conversation beyond also the blue and white and try to address other center than just the Delftware. But for you, you saw that collection. As you put it in your book, you had a spell has been cast when you first saw the collection. So what is this personal connection that you have, and why ceramic and Delftware was so fascinating? What do you find so fascinating about it?
That's a great question, because I feel when I say a spell had been cast, it's really describing a moment, you know, when you step into a space, into an environment when you're surrounded by objects and time just starts, it just pauses. I think growing up in Washington, I had a similar experience at the Peacock Room, you know, at the Freer, which is phenomenal. I know, Jody, have you had a moment when you've...
I do remember going to the Freer for the first time, and it was when I was in college, and it was eye-opening, partly because I had grown up in interiors that were basically 18th century French, and the idea that something existed that was not 18th century French was a great eye-opener. And that's style of decorating with layers and layers and layers that one finds at the Freer, with all different Asian countries coming in with Whistler pictures in the middle of it, definitely did stick with me as well.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
Yeah,
In a good way.
It was unavailable to be seen for so long that now that it is again available, I think we should all hop Amtrak and head down at some point.
So Jody, for you also, that was your moment when you first went to the Freer, or what do you?
No,
because you also devoted most of your career with ceramic.
What got me started really being involved in decorative arts was a combination of my father owning this enormous book of Matisse cutouts, and I adore really bright, saturated colors. And being able to sit on his bed with that book on my knee and look at it was also an eye-opener. As was literally going every single Saturday to what was then Park Burnett to an exhibition. And my sister's sitting in the room, she will remember this very well. If we were good little girls and did not drag on our father's knee, because in those days there was a decorative art sale on exhibition every single weekend. If we were good little girls and didn't demand to leave immediately, we would be taken across the street after the view had been properly gone through for a ham sandwich and a chocolate milkshake every single Saturday. And that really is what got me involved
Positive
in this whole
reinforcement.
wonderful world.
Robert, can you tell us in a few words, how did you get into this ceramic world and what fascinates you about it?
Well, for me, of course, it also started with my father, even with my grandfather, because I was sitting on the dinner table with them as a 3, 4, 5-year-old boy and listening to all the conversations about ceramics, about the history. And growing up, I thought that a discovery couldn't be made anymore, that everything was known about a product that was made at that time 150 years ago and before that. And when I went into the business myself, I started at the age of 19 working at Sotheby's in London. I noticed that not only it was not a world of fathers and grandfathers, it was a very young world, but there was also this fascination with the discoveries, the research, the amount of pieces that nobody had ever seen before. And still until today, there's objects, and I have some in the stand also, that there's no equal to. There's nothing in literature. There's the first ones known. So that excitement of discovery, and I'm going to show a couple of examples, is really what drove me deeper into the business. And I love books. I always loved books from a young age. I just went flicking through books and finding things that I wasn't looking for, but still enjoyed so much. So yeah, it's come from a young age with me.
So the hunt and the discoveries. So let's talk about that. Vivi, you kind of started your book. What started this idea? This was finding this puzzle jar and a mark underneath, and start question. And how many of us, when you're in the field, collectors, dealers, scholars, we have objects, we don't really know what they are, and we start looking at them and we start finding clues in the shape, in decoration, the mark underneath, and we put together a story, and we try to unveil the story of the object and tell that story. So do you want to tell a little bit more about the discoveries that you find and you put?
Yeah, the process is interesting because Beyond Blue and White is a work of, it's narrative nonfiction. So my goal is to not just dig into just not only the objects, but the lives behind the objects. And so that necessitated, the deep dive into archives. So I'm literally, for an example of 17th century women, like these female Delftware owners, literally you're going into tax records, birth and death, burial, estate inventories. And I think one of the most interesting sort of discoveries and just personal moments for me was an archive of an estate inventory taken after the death of Barbara Rodeville, with the notary going room by room, opening drawer by drawer. And what do they find? And, and Jody and Robert and all of us know when you're creating these estate inventories are really, it's an eyewitness account of walking through someone's life. And so that was just a deep connection for me. I think at the very end of the inventory, there was the notary opens the drawer and there's a gold hairpin with the initials BR on it, which she obviously wore. So it brings the past to life.
But you need to tell the story also, because sometimes you just have this element of objects and archives, and you need to put all of that together. And that is maybe, Jody and Robert, can you tell objects that you have recently, stories of discoveries?
I was very lucky when I was asked to do this panel because, as it happens, Christie's has for sale in 2 weeks' time the estate of Irene Roosevelt Aiken. She, in terms of talking about women, and we haven't really gotten into it yet at this point, but talking about women as collectors and, more importantly, as curators of the collections that they form and telling stories, she is kind of the epitome of a 20th and 21st century key to that whole possibility. Her collection comes in layers, as everything that Vivi was saying comes in. It's a collection that was formed by a combination of her predecessor as Russell Aitken's first wife, of her first husband's collection, and of the collection that she and Russell Aitken, and then she on her own, continued to put together. And lucky for me, there is one object in that sale that is the epitome of an 18th century female who was the power and the influence behind the French royal, at that point, now national manufacturer of France, and that was Vincennes, then the Sèvres porcelain factory. And that woman was Madame de Pompadour. So the really cute little boy who's in the portrait above is Louis XV's first grandson. He very sadly only lived to be 9.5 years old. There is a piece in Irene Aitken's collection, which is an écuelle. An écuelle is basically a covered broth bowl. It was never meant to be part of a big service. It was always meant to be a very intimate object that was used in your dressing room. If you look, you'll see there's a fish that is the finial on the cover. So there are many Sèvres and Vincennes écuelles that have this fish finial. They are all top quality. And one of the beauties of the Vincennes and Sèvres porcelain manufactory is that the period archives and sales records from the 18th and into the 19th, and they're still going, the 20th and the 21st century, are still available. And as Vivi said, you go down a rabbit hole and start digging. With this particular piece, the snippet that I've pasted into the corner of this slide that shows the 18th century handwritten ledgers that were done where each piece was described. And the detective work is to try and find, with a description that's literally 3 words long if you're lucky, and match it up with the object. So this says livré à Madame de Pompadour, so delivered to Madame de Pompadour. It has the date of 1752. The grandson was born in September of 1751. If you go down where it says 28 December, that's the third little snippet, it says écuelle deuxième, for deuxième grandeur. They came in Mama Bear, Papa Bear, Baby Bear. Gilt white. That's it, gilt white. And a price of 192 livres. And underneath, a second entry for the stand. 192 livres is a fortune for a single piece. And the gilding on this object is far richer than what one would normally find on an object of that time. Can you see the richness and the tooling on that gold? That's all hand chased after the fact. If you look, the cover, the bowl, and the stand each have these little vignettes that are trophies of military trophies, scientific trophies, things that would have all had to do with the developing knowledge at that time in the mid-18th century. And that crowned interlaced L mark is a mark that I have never, ever seen, but it would seem to be very connected with the French royal family because of the crown. That is a ducal crown, and the grandson was the Duc de Bourgogne, and his three younger brothers were the Duc de Berry, the Comte d'Artois, but either way, the three boys all became king after Louis XVI. The quality of this object is definitely of royal caliber. The entry has been published as having been acquired by Madame de Pompadour, and Rosalind Saville, in her recent book about the day-to-day, practically hour-by-hour life of Madame de Pompadour, cites it as having been acquired and potentially having been thought of as a present for Madame de Pompadour's father. But it strikes me that with all of these connecting points to the king, that crown that is definitely a connecting point to the Dauphin, that's the center of the stand. Can you see how it's a fountain that's supported on the tail of a dolphin, which is the symbol of the Dauphin? And if you look at the military trophy that's the upper left-hand corner, and then that flag that's kind of hanging out below, it was very difficult to photograph, but in that flag is incised the interlaced L's that are the symbol for the royal family. So it strikes me, I have absolutely no confirmed archival proof, but it certainly is what makes sense, that rather than being a present for Papa, this was more likely destined as a present for the king from his then official mistress. It's an extraordinary object. Ros Saville did actually see it in person in 2002, and she wrote a really lovely letter to Irene Aiken, congratulating her on having it in the collection and saying, you know, I'm convinced that this was done in celebration of the birth of the Dauphin. He would have been born the year before it was made. It obviously took a certain amount of time for it to be made. And it's a one-off object in a female collection originally owned by a female collector, and the French version of Gertrude, the supporter, not the owner of the factory, but Madame de Pompadour really was the support of the Vincennes and Sèvres factory as it was getting on its legs and becoming arguably the best porcelain manufactory in Europe. I think Meissen and Germans might have a word to say about that, but at a certain point, they had the market.
But as a term of discoveries, it's also interesting that you were always built on others' discoveries. Someone sees things
You have
and
to
just, and you have to.
It's built on other people's discoveries, and what's really important when you're doing any kind of archival research is you can read other people's discoveries, but you shouldn't take everything for granted, because with time, the way that this information gets interpreted can change. And if anybody has jumped to a conclusion, you have to be really careful not to automatically repeat everything, or the jumping to that conclusion is just going to self-perpetuate and never be appropriately corrected.
Yeah. And sometimes we find the object that make a proof or go in one direction or in the other.
Yeah.
So do you have a story to share with us also about
I
how
do
to-
indeed. So I have a very exciting story, and I made a write-up about it too. And in the foreword of the publication, I wrote that as an antique dealer, you dream of these instances, but most antique dealers don't get the chance to ever do it. So it's, of course, it's about 10% hard work and 90% of good luck. But I had the good fortune of discovering a couple of very nice objects. And I think one of the most known stories and one of the best stories also is this blue and white figure made in the end of the 17th century. It's the figure of a lady, but you saw already the print that Vivi showed of Queen Mary and the importance of Queen Mary to Delftware. She was really the patron of the factories in Delft. She was collecting blue and white. She loved her flowers and gardening. And when I bought this figure from a collector in Antwerp, I thought, okay, this lady, she is wearing a pearl necklace. She has her hair, as what they say in French, à la Fontaine, something that was only done at the courts of Europe. And she's holding a basket pierced with holes on the top for flowers. So I presented this figure at TEFAF Maastricht 2014. And there you jump the gun sometimes. It's very funny that a dealer can actually do that and say, this is my gut feeling. There's no proof for it, but based on certain points, I do think that this is a figure of Queen Mary. And I do understand also, because I think that she started buying with the Greek A factory under Samuel van Eenhoorn. Samuel van Eenhoorn passed away, and Adrianus Cox took over right at the moment that she started collecting. And I think that Adrianus Cox, who wanted to keep one of the best clients as a client for his factory, produced a figure like this for her and probably gifted it to her. Like I said, I presented it at TEFAF Maastricht. There were a couple of specialists that say, first of all, you can't say that it's Queen Mary. Second of all, you can't say that it's marked, that it's made at the Greek A factory because it's not a marked figure. I had an offer of a Belgian client, didn't take the offer, so took the figure back home with me afterwards. TEFAF Maastricht, just to let you know, is in March. And in early June of the same year, in my mailbox falls a letter-size paper with a listing of a small auction in France. And on that listing, there was a one-liner, a bouquetière en Delft. The bouquetière is a very strange word that we usually don't use for a flower vase. We usually say a tulip vase, so not a vase for a bunch of flowers. And by the way, I must say, I'm admiring the tulips in front of me here, wondering if this is especially done for us, but it's very beautiful to sit behind tulips. So I immediately asked for photos of that piece at the auction, and I received back a bunch of photographs that looked very much like this figure. And I couldn't believe it really. Like I had to ground myself thinking, it can't be possible that within a time frame of about 6 months, I'm finding both a male figure and a female figure that maybe once belonged together. So the female figure, as you can see here also with the pearl necklace, had all the hallmarks of Queen Mary, and the male figure had all the hallmarks of King William. So I had the figure brought over, and I actually asked for a photographer to come. And this is the moment that I'm putting the two pieces together. What is it then? Late 2014. Need export licenses from France and all these type of things. And this is the moment that the figure of the male figure is brought in. Looking at the dress, it's the same type of dress. The decoration on the base is exactly the same. This male figure is wearing a cravat, a Venetian cravat. Something that King William was always known to be wearing. Even in the shower, he didn't take off his Venetian cravat. And the best of all, this male figure is marked AK. It's marked for the Greek A factory, for Adrianus Cox. So this was the moment that I said, okay, we need to really research these two figures. And we published it before in 2015, early 2015. As King William and Queen Mary. I presented them actually for a group of 300 people at the Kunstmuseum in The Hague. And immediately afterwards, one of the Dutch collectors came to me and said, listen, we need to keep this for the Dutch collection, for the Netherlands. And in the end, we were able to work together, and the Kunstmuseum in The Hague bought this pair from me, but not after bringing them here to the winter show, actually, and showing them here at the winter show. So I had them here at the winter show. I think I actually got the telephone call while being at the winter show from the director of the Kunstmuseum in The Hague saying, it's done, we'll have them. Funds are almost ready. It wasn't completely ready, but we'll get there in the end. So that was a very exciting find, and something that doesn't happen all the time, of course. But true finds do exist, because I want to tell about this garniture that I presented last year at TEVAF Maastricht. The pair of vases on the outside was a pair of beautiful vases, and they're about 2 feet high, so it's really a large set of vases. I bought them from a private collector in Sweden in the summer of 2024. I had them shipped over to Holland. I love them. They're very high quality. They are marked for Gerrit Kam, factory owner of the 3 Ash Barrels factory. And I love the pair. Even I had dinner with a friend of mine, and I said, oh, I have my highlight for TEVAF Maastricht already, a pair of vases. Not very long after, the middle vase came to an auction in Paris. And the middle vase was described as being marked for another factory, for the metal pot factory. I remember that my father had sold this actual vase to a collector in Belgium. And now the collector in Belgium sold the center vase with cover, which, by the way, is very rare to have the original cover on it, through an auction in Paris. I went ahead, I placed an offer, exceeding what I actually wanted to pay, but I found it so beautiful, never combining the two things in my mind yet, because one was described from the Ash Barrels factory and the other was described from the metal pot factory. Again, I had a ship to Amsterdam, and I was actually traveling when my colleague Femke called me, and she said, Robert, they look very much like the other pair. I said, well, it's not possible because it's 2 different factories, so how can it be so close together? So no, she said, I had a look at the mark, and it's not the metal pot factory, it's the GK mark for Gerrit Kam of the 3 Ash Barrels factory. They're identical. Now, the pair of vases was at the restore. There was a couple of little chips on the upper rims. The next day, I went to pick up these vases. We placed them together, and we were super excited to find that they looked identical. Now, looking identical doesn't prove anything, of course, apart from the fact that they were made at the same time. Went back to my father's archives, and my father had written, sometimes it's even less than a sentence or 3 words, 1 word, ex-Holzinski. So that put us on a path to researching the Holzinski collection. Oskar Holzinski lived in Berlin. He was a banker, an affluent collector, but he came into dire straits and had to sell part of his collection at auction in Berlin in 1928. Finding the descriptions of the pieces, there were 2 lot numbers. 1 lot, a Dutch Delftware pair of vases, and 1 lot, a vase and cover. Descriptive, I was there. Absolute proof, I wasn't there yet. But I went ahead and I found a complete auction catalog. And at that time, by the way, the auction catalogs were huge, 2 feet high in themselves, an incredible book. I found an example here in the United States through A-Books, and I had it sent over to Holland. And when we opened the catalog, there it was. 2 lot numbers, if I remember correctly, 228 and 229. With this photo next to it, we compared little strokes, little dots in the glazing, everything to find this is absolutely the set that was sold by Oskar Holzinski in 1928. They were together until 1928, and I presented them at TEVAF Maastricht 2025, almost 100 years later, sold them to a private collector who now has them in his hallway with the catalog of 1928 next to them. But these exciting finds also go a bit further, because this is a very beautiful pair of butter tubs, we call them. They're tureens and covers. They're modeled as ducks sitting on their nest. I have a similar pair at the stand if anybody wants to come over and have a look. But I was excited because I had already read Vivi's book by that time. And when I turned them around, there it was. The GVS mark. Yeah. So I had to think of you. I took out my... my book of marks, written by Mrs. This is one of the
It's a book
the hunters.
yes, that's a China hunter's little mini handbook for the road.
Right, exactly. And then when I open it up,
Collector's Guide.
and then when I open it up to page number 56, you can actually find the mark there. And when I read next to it, it says 61 to 63. So there's 3 marks at Oude Moriaanshoofd. The old Morse head factory, Geertruiverstelle, and this was made by her in the years of, doesn't even say the years, but it's the 1760s of the 18th century. So excited with that find, which I'll present at TEVAF Maastricht in the coming year.
Oh my goodness! Congratulations!
Thank you for this, and also for doing a wonderful transition to the last question or aspect of your book, Vivi, that I want to discuss is the woman, the from the making and to the patronage, collecting afterwards. It seems that, first of all, for your book, yes, it's a starting point of your story, but why did you decide to look at the history of Delftware from the making to the patronage to the collecting through the lens of this woman? Why woman? And
It's a great question, Charlotte, because I mean, I feel as, as a woman in, working in the auction world, it's hidden in plain sight, but it's something that I think I believe in serendipity. I think it was a question that was always in the back of my mind. So when something just presents itself, like the puzzle jug with the GVS, it sends you on a path, but you have to be at a certain point. And it was, I think it was a question all along.
so for the historian and specialist of Delftware, it was a story that was not known because for Serre, for example, and for France, women have been central to the history of this manufactory. So is it the same for also maybe British center or other centers, that maybe the story of women and their part in the making and patronage have not been that central?
I'd say it depends on the timing. So there's a big difference between British manufacturing and continental manufacturing for the ceramics industry, in that on the continent, most of these factories were connected in some way to the king, the prince, the duke. In the 18th century, they were a little bit like owning a race car today. It was boys and their toys, huge competition as to who had the best, a lot of industrial espionage going on from one factory to the other as literally chemistry developed itself and how one could achieve these amazing bright colors and develop stronger and better pace continued. In England, it was very much done as a business and much more of a middle-class business than an aristocratic business, and I think more controlled by men. But once you start getting into the 20th century, you have a lot of not owners, but designers and decorators who were very definitely women and had a huge influence on what it was that was produced at that factory. And one of the biggest that comes to mind, if anybody knows Wedgwood porcelain, is Fairyland Leicester, and a woman called Daisy McKay Jones, who was active and working well into the 1920s and had a huge influence on design and color and the commercial success of that factory.
But do
she
you feel
didn't
that
own
this
it.
story is known and shared?
For those that are interested in that factory, yes. And there is a lot of information out there on some of these decorators, partly because things were marked. And once you can start digging in the archives and figuring out whose initials are on the bottom and what the timing was, you've at least got some place to start your investigating. It's very frustrating if you have nothing and are second guessing.
Robert, do you want to say something about this subject?
For Delftware, and looking from a Dutch Delftware point of view, it was always a given. So it's funny, I heard it being said before, when something is hidden in plain sight, for me it was such a normal thing that women were as active in the business in the factories as the men were, that it never stood out to me as being something particularly special. That, of course, and we read it back in the book also, that the Dutch ladies had a fantastic education. They were on par with the men in the education system. And because of that, they were able to run factories. In a lot of cases, after their husbands passed away, they continued, or even if we look at the Moorshead factory, we see that even from the 17th century, the ladies were the active motors between the men, who were probably just the the frontal of the business, but it was the women who were actually doing it.
To follow that up is that I think that Delftware is unique because, yes, to Jody's point, yes, we know of like certain women, whether in patrons in French ceramics or English makers, but Delftware is unique because it's a vehicle that covers all of these subjects from maker to patron to, collector. And so that's unique within the decorative arts because you'll get these pinpoints, but never the entire umbrella, which is what Delftware offers, like as a subject.
And also what kind of archives exist and can support that. Sometimes we just don't know. And
The Dutch are amazing archivists. Oh, amazing.
And they're keeping records. Before we are taking questions, we just discussed the fact that I'm going to tell you a few words about the Sèvres, how it worked, because I was the director of the Sèvres Museum for a few years. And I initiated over there an exhibition on the woman at Sèvres. And I think actually that was also kind of hidden. I mean, why? The first question the people were asking me, we know the patrons, Madame de Pompadour and du Barry and Marie Antoinette and all of the great patrons, but the women at Sèvres, they were like, who were these? None, probably. And actually, no. From the beginning of Vincennes Sèvres, and that is what I'm showing it here, you have actually the flowers, which was really the landing of the starting of these gorgeous flowers that starting the manufactory at Vincennes and Sèvres. That were done by women, and there were many women that were actually working in the manufactory. They were like in other factories in Europe. When a man had a position and he died, very often the widows was allowed to take his place. The children's, there were also systems that the children's could be trained and have some advantage of working in the manufactory, including the girls. There is now a very well-known painter from the early 19th century called Marie-Victoire Jacotot, who was actually one of the greatest painters on porcelain ever and extremely successful by herself. And she specialized in doing all master paintings on porcelain plaque. And she was so gifted that she was received by the king at the time and was really considered, and is still considered today, as one of the greatest painters. There is also, so I dig into the archives and I found this wonderful watercolor actually of Éléonore Escalier a little later in the 19th century, who was, you see her here like painting, and she was hired by Sèvres and worked for several years. And her name, I've never heard about her before, going into the archives. And she was specialized, as in the late 19th century, by doing this beautiful decoration of very Asian type, Chinese type, very fin de siècle decoration on Sèvres vases. And her name never appeared, but she left all of her drawing and archives at Sèvres. So it is easy to recreate and study again that woman, but she has not yet had her own book, an own study, and own exhibition. So she's definitely someone that needs to be studied. And I run into this fantastic person, which is who is the daughter of René Lalique, who is also a célèbre glassmaker and ceramist, and with Suzanne Lalique Aviland, and she married into the Aviland from Limoges, so ceramic family, and she worked at Sèvres, and during the Art Deco period created also amazing decoration, and her entire archives are also kept at the archive at Sèvres with beautiful drawings. But when you see a piece like that in a fair or on the auction on the market or elsewhere, and you don't especially have a mark and you don't really know who did it, you will just put an Art Deco Sèvres set, and suddenly you can look and understand. And she had a fascinating life, actually. She was also a designer for the opera. And so she has an entire different career as a set designer. I mean, fascinating story of multidisciplinary woman and very creative woman. And I will finish my very, very short overview of important women who worked at Sèvres with Phonse Franck, who was actually American, who grew up in the village in New York with all of the artists, and she decided to move to France. And she discover Sèvres and just managed to become a ceramist and work at Sèvres. And she's one of the first women who actually created new shapes. The other were more decorators and paintings on existing shape. And she was really a designer and very influenced also by Asian ceramic and had really an important impact on the evolution of Sèvres. So I was there and just realized that there were many stories not written yet, and definitely very often stories of women that whose names have not come forefront into the story of the manufacturing. So just a little something to think, to discuss. So we would love to welcome any question to anyone on any aspect that we have discussed today.
Why does the Queen of England collect Dutch Delft at a time when that ceramic is made in her own country, blue and white, tin glazed earthenware?
It's a very interesting question, and I can fill a speech about that story in itself. Queen Mary was the daughter of the King of England, and she married William, who was a Dutchman, stadhouder, not king yet, stadholder. So she moved to the Netherlands, and she actually lived in the Netherlands for quite a long time, partly in The Hague, partly at Loo Palace in Apeldoorn, all the way to the east of the country. I think especially in the time that she lived in The Hague, she was acquainted with the Dutch Delftware, with the ceramics from Delft. The Hague and Delft are very close to each other. Delft lays in between Rotterdam and The Hague, so it was very close. The city of Delft was exporting its product along the trade routes that they had built up in the early 17th century when Chinese porcelain was coming in to the Netherlands. So they were selling it far and wide. And I'm sure that Queen Mary would have gotten in touch in the time that she lived in The Hague, mere steps from where this product was made.
I think just to add to that, I think she was clearly drawn to the beautiful aesthetic, but it also it symbolized power, and it symbolized that Dutch-English alliance, and the objects themselves became diplomatic, symbols for that, that really effective co-rule.
If anyone's familiar with there was a period room at the Museum of the City of New York that came from the home of Stephen Whitney down at Bowling Green. It's now the Custom House. And I always admired it, but I never connected it to the fact that it was the Whitney home or where that Whitney home was. And it had blue and white Delft tiles around and now it's not on view anymore, but I just wondered if anyone knew anything about that.
No, I don't know specifically about the tiles at the Whitney House. What I do know is that there were already pieces of Dutch Delftware coming into America, into the United States, around 1700. So there's been finds from all kinds of sites, especially more down south, where Dutch Delftware pieces from around 1700 were found and must have been buried before 1710, 1720. Around that age.
And I know here in New York, Stanford White loved blue and white tiles. A lot of his interiors, including his own house, featured blue and white Dutch tiles. I think he sourced them from Europe. So
thank you first all of the person in these panels. Thank you, Vivi, for the book, Jody, Robert, for being here. Thank you all for being with us today.